The easiest way to underestimate a man is to judge the cover instead of the story. The laughter came first, sharp enough to turn heads, yet casual enough that no one rushed to stop it. Officer Daniel Brooks leaned against the polished marble column outside the grand entrance of the Jefferson State Justice Leadership Forum. His uniform crisp, his badge catching the bright spring sunlight as attorneys, judges, professors, and law students streamed through the security checkpoint. He watched a tall black man step onto the front walkway, carrying nothing more than a worn leather briefcase and a framed Columbia Law School degree tucked carefully beneath one arm. The frame showed tiny scratches along the edges, the kind earned over years rather than days. Yet Daniel barely glanced at it before a smirk spread across his face. "Well, look at that," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Guess they're selling Columbia degrees at yard sales now." A few people exchanged uncertain smiles while others lowered their eyes and kept walking, unwilling to become part of whatever was unfolding. The man paused only long enough to meet Daniel's gaze. His expression remained calm, almost impossibly calm, as though years of discipline had taught him that every careless word eventually revealed more about the speaker than the target. "Good morning, officer," he said in a measured voice. "My name is Marcus Ellison. I'm here for the keynote program." Daniel chuckled, extending one hand before Marcus could continue. "Hold on. You expect me to believe that?" His eyes drifted toward the framed diploma again. "That looks important. Must be nice carrying props." The surrounding crowd slowed almost instinctively. Conversations softened. A young associate from a downtown law firm looked uncomfortable, while two law students whispered to each other without taking their eyes off Marcus. The city skyline reflected across the courthouse windows, throwing bright patches of light across the granite steps, but the attention of everyone nearby had settled on this single exchange. Marcus adjusted his grip on the frame with deliberate care, making sure the glass remained steady. "It isn't a prop," he replied evenly. "It's something I worked very hard to earn." Daniel laughed again, louder this time. "Sure you did. And I'm guessing next you'll tell me you're running the Department of Justice." Several people let out nervous laughs, more from social pressure than amusement. Marcus never responded to them. Instead, he looked briefly toward the entrance where event staff welcomed distinguished guests beneath banners celebrating leadership, integrity, and equal justice under law. Those words fluttered gently in the spring breeze above the doorway, standing in quiet contrast to everything happening below them. Daniel folded his arms. "You know, people can print just about anything these days. Fancy paper, fancy frames, fancy stories." Marcus simply nodded once. "That's true," he answered. "But the truth doesn't become less real because someone refuses to recognize it." For the first time, Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsettled not by defiance, but by composure. Marcus never raised his voice, never argued, never tried to impress anyone standing nearby. He merely stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime earning respect that did not depend on another person's approval. Around them, the morning continued exactly as planned. Luxury sedans rolled toward the valet stand. Television crews prepared cameras near the courthouse lawn. Distinguished guests checked their watches before entering the building. Somewhere inside, microphones were being tested for the ceremony that would begin in less than an hour. Outside, however, no one realized they were witnessing the first moments of a story that would challenge every assumption made that morning. Because sometimes the greatest authority arrives without an escort, the strongest credentials never need to be announced, and the loudest laughter is only seconds away from becoming complete silence. Marcus Ellison waited without a trace of impatience, his fingers resting lightly on the handle of the weathered leather briefcase that had accompanied him through courtrooms, lecture halls, and countless early mornings long before anyone ever associated his name with influence. Around him, the entrance to the Jefferson State Justice Leadership Forum continued to fill with distinguished guests. Federal judges greeted former classmates with warm smiles. District attorneys exchanged business cards with professors from prestigious law schools. Television reporters adjusted microphones, while photographers searched for the perfect angle beneath the courthouse steps. The entire morning carried an air of celebration, yet Marcus seemed completely detached from the prestige surrounding him. He was more interested in watching a young law student help an elderly veteran climb the stairs than in the cameras pointed toward the entrance. Officer Daniel Brooks noticed that calmness and somehow found it irritating. In his experience, people who were challenged usually became defensive, raised their voices, or demanded special treatment. Marcus did none of those things. Instead, he stood patiently, allowing every unnecessary remark to fade into the spring air without answering it with anger. Daniel stepped closer and extended one hand toward the framed diploma. "Let me see this masterpiece," he said with a grin that invited the nearby crowd to enjoy the moment with him. Marcus handed it over carefully, trusting that it would be treated with basic respect. Daniel tilted the frame toward the sunlight and examined the familiar Columbia University seal. "Looks expensive," he remarked. "Probably cost more than the education itself." A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the gathering. Marcus simply replied, "Education is measured by what you learn, not by what someone else believes about it." Daniel rolled his eyes before handing the frame back. "Nice speech. Did you memorize that too?" Nearby, two courthouse employees quietly exchanged glances. One recognized Marcus immediately, but remained silent, choosing to observe rather than interrupt. Across the plaza, several members of the event security team arrived wearing plain navy suits instead of uniforms. Their movements were subtle, almost invisible among the growing crowd, yet each of them briefly scanned the entrance before continuing inside. Marcus noticed them, but gave no sign that he had. Daniel never looked in their direction. His attention remained fixed on the man standing before him. "Tell me something," Daniel continued. "If your degree is real, what brings someone like you here? Looking for a job? Hoping somebody important notices you?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "I came because I accepted an invitation." Daniel laughed again. "Everybody says they have an invitation." He gestured toward the checkpoint where guests presented digital credentials before entering. "Then show me yours." Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his navy blazer and removed a simple white invitation envelope. There were no gold letters on the outside, no elaborate design, only his name printed neatly across the front. Daniel opened it without asking permission, unfolded the invitation, glanced at it for barely a second, and shrugged. Could have printed this at any office supply store. He folded it again and returned it carelessly. Marcus slipped the invitation back into his pocket with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. Above the entrance, banners displaying the words integrity, service, and equal justice swayed gently in the breeze while guests continued entering beneath them. Every passing minute drew the ceremony closer. Somewhere inside the building, the opening music had already begun its final rehearsal. Outside, however, an entirely different performance was unfolding, one built not on speeches or applause, but on assumptions. Daniel believed he had already figured Marcus out after only a few minutes. What he failed to understand was that true character often remains invisible to those who stop looking the moment they think they already know the answer. Marcus Ellison accepted the quiet that followed with the same steady composure that had carried him through decades of courtrooms where the loudest voice rarely belonged to the person with the strongest case. He glanced briefly at the large courthouse clock above the entrance. Less than 45 minutes remained before the opening ceremony. He had arrived early by design, believing that punctuality reflected respect for everyone else's time, a lesson his father had taught him while driving an old pickup truck across Georgia when Marcus was still a teenager dreaming about becoming a lawyer. Those memories returned for only a moment before fading beneath the sounds of polished dress shoes crossing stone steps and the distant hum of television crews preparing their morning broadcasts. Daniel Brooks watched Marcus with growing curiosity hidden beneath sarcasm. Something about the man refused to fit the story Daniel had already written in his mind. Most people who found themselves questioned in front of strangers either became frustrated or eager to prove themselves. Marcus did neither. He simply observed the people around him with genuine interest. A nervous first-year law student dropped a folder, scattering papers across the sidewalk. Before anyone else reacted, Marcus quietly knelt, gathered each page in order, and handed the folder back with a warm smile. "Congratulations on making it this far," he said. "The first day is always the hardest." The student thanked him, unaware that the stranger offering encouragement had once stood exactly where she was now. Daniel shook his head with an amused grin. "Trying to look important already?" Marcus answered calmly. "No, just trying to be helpful." The simplicity of that reply left Daniel without an immediate comeback. So he shifted his attention toward the growing line of invited guests. Black sport utility vehicles rolled to the curb one after another, releasing elected officials, judges, and university presidents who were welcomed by event coordinators waiting beneath the courthouse columns. Several greeted one another by first name, laughing about old cases and law school memories. Marcus recognized many of them, yet he made no effort to approach anyone. Instead, he remained exactly where he had been standing since he arrived, allowing each person to enjoy the morning without interruption. Across the plaza, one of the plainclothes security officers discreetly touched an earpiece after catching sight of Marcus. Another gave a nearly invisible nod before returning to his assigned position near the entrance. Their movements were professional enough that almost no one noticed. Daniel certainly did not. He remained convinced that the man before him was simply another visitor hoping to gain access to an exclusive event. "You know," Daniel said while folding his arms again, "people spend years trying to get invited here. They work connections. They make phone calls. Sometimes they even fake credentials. You would be surprised." Marcus looked toward the courthouse doors where volunteers welcomed every guest with the same smile regardless of title or reputation. "Respect should never depend on assumptions," he replied quietly. "Sometimes the person standing in front of you has already earned more than you can see." Daniel let out a dismissive laugh. "That sounds like something printed inside a fortune cookie." Marcus smiled politely, but said nothing more. The silence lingered between them, interrupted only by the distant ringing of church bells marking the half-hour. A cool spring breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees across the courthouse lawn as American flags above the building fluttered against a cloudless blue sky. The entire city seemed ready to celebrate leadership, public service, and justice. Yet only a few feet from the entrance, the most important lesson of the day had already begun unfolding, and almost everyone watching still believed they understood exactly who Marcus Ellison was, never realizing that the greatest misunderstanding was not about the framed diploma in his hands, but about the remarkable life that had earned it. The line at the security checkpoint continued moving until it reached Marcus Ellison once again. A volunteer reached for the handheld scanner with a welcoming smile, but before she could speak, Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward and raised one hand. "I will take this one," he said with quiet confidence, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment. The volunteer hesitated before stepping aside. Marcus remained where he was, his expression unchanged, the framed Columbia diploma resting carefully against his side, while the leather briefcase remained in his other hand. Daniel extended his palm. "Everything out of the briefcase." Marcus complied without complaint. A legal notebook, several neatly organized folders, a fountain pen, reading glasses, and a slim portfolio were placed carefully on the inspection table. Nothing appeared unusual. Daniel examined each item with exaggerated attention before lifting the framed diploma once more. "You really carry this everywhere?" he asked loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "That must mean it is the most important thing you have." Marcus answered with the same measured tone that had frustrated Daniel from the very beginning. "It reminds me where hard work can lead when someone believes in education." Daniel tilted the frame from side to side before placing it back on the table with little interest. "Funny," he replied. "Most successful lawyers I know do not need to carry proof around." Several people waiting nearby slowed their pace, sensing the growing tension without understanding its cause. A retired judge standing farther back quietly observed the exchange, saying nothing. Two young prosecutors exchanged uncertain looks, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to interfere with a uniformed officer performing what appeared to be a routine inspection. Daniel reached for the invitation envelope again. He studied it longer than before, turning it over several times as though expecting it to reveal some hidden flaw. "This invitation does not tell me much," he finally said. "Anyone can write a name on an envelope." Marcus nodded politely. "If you need additional verification, I will be happy to wait until the event coordinator arrives." The answer seemed to irritate Daniel even more because it offered no argument to challenge. Instead of ending the inspection, he looked Marcus up and down before asking, "Tell me something. Why would somebody with your background receive a personal invitation to one of the biggest legal leadership events in the state?" Marcus met his eyes without hesitation. "Perhaps because someone believed my experience could contribute to the conversation." Daniel smiled with unmistakable disbelief. Or perhaps somebody made a mistake. The words lingered in the air as another black sport utility vehicle quietly pulled to the curb. Several men and women in tailored suits stepped out, exchanging brief nods with plainclothes security before entering through a side entrance. None of them interrupted the checkpoint. None of them acknowledged Marcus directly. Yet one security officer glanced toward him for the briefest moment before touching an earpiece and continuing inside. Daniel remained completely unaware of the subtle exchange. His attention never left the man standing before him. He believed he was exposing someone pretending to belong in a room reserved for accomplished leaders. What he could not see was that every unnecessary question, every sarcastic remark, and every public assumption was quietly becoming part of a much larger story unfolding around him. Marcus gathered his belongings with deliberate care, sliding the notebook back into the briefcase before gently wiping a fingerprint from the glass covering his diploma. There was no anger in his movements, no embarrassment, and no desire to prove himself. He simply waited with remarkable patience while the courthouse clock continued counting down the final minutes before the ceremony. Unaware to everyone except a very small handful of people that the guest standing calmly at the security checkpoint was not waiting for permission to enter the event, but for the right moment to let the truth enter the room first. Marcus Ellison closed the clasps of his briefcase and stepped quietly to the side exactly as Officer Daniel Brooks had instructed. He did not protest, did not demand an explanation, and did not remind anyone that every other guest had already entered the building. Instead, he stood beneath the shade of a stone column overlooking the courthouse plaza while the steady rhythm of arrivals continued uninterrupted. Luxury sedans rolled toward the entrance every few minutes, their doors opening to welcome respected judges, elected officials, university deans, and senior attorneys. Event staff greeted each guest with practiced warmth before escorting them inside. Marcus simply watched the morning unfold with patient curiosity, almost as though he had all the time in the world. Daniel interpreted that calmness as defeat. "Looks like your big day is not going the way you planned," he remarked with another confident smile. Marcus answered quietly, "Sometimes the most important meetings begin with waiting." Daniel laughed to himself before turning his attention toward another arriving vehicle. What escaped his notice was everything happening around him. A plainclothes security supervisor paused just inside the courthouse entrance after receiving a brief message through an earpiece. He glanced toward Marcus for only a second before speaking softly into a handheld radio. Moments later, another member of the security detail appeared near the registration table, reviewing a printed schedule while discreetly scanning the plaza. Their movements blended naturally into the activity surrounding the event, invisible to nearly everyone except those trained to recognize them. Nearby, the retired judge who had observed the earlier exchange quietly approached one of the event coordinators and whispered something while pointing gently toward the entrance. The coordinator looked surprised, checked a digital guest list on a tablet, then immediately lowered the screen before anyone else could read it. She did not walk outside. She simply nodded once and disappeared into the building at a brisk but controlled pace. Marcus noticed each subtle movement without reacting. Years of public service had taught him that important decisions were often made quietly, long before anyone else realized they were happening. Daniel, however, remained convinced that nothing unusual was taking place. To him, the situation appeared simple. A man carrying an impressive diploma had arrived claiming to belong among influential leaders. Until proven otherwise, Daniel believed caution justified every unnecessary delay. Across the plaza, a local news crew adjusted its cameras toward the courthouse entrance in preparation for live coverage of the opening ceremony. Their producer pointed toward arriving guests, discussing camera angles and interview positions. None of them realized that the most significant story of the morning was unfolding only a few yards away, hidden beneath ordinary conversation and quiet assumptions. Marcus glanced once at the large American flag waving above the courthouse roof before checking the time on his watch. Less than 15 minutes remained before the program would begin. He carefully brushed a speck of dust from the corner of his Columbia diploma, not because he was worried about appearances, but because it represented decades of sacrifice shared by parents, teachers, mentors, and friends who had believed in him long before titles ever followed his name. Daniel noticed the gesture and smiled again. "You really treasure that frame," he said. Marcus looked back at him with genuine kindness. Not because of the paper inside it, he replied. Because it reminds me of every person who opened a door instead of closing one. For the first time that morning, Daniel found himself without an immediate response. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the courthouse doors opened once more and several senior event organizers emerged together, scanning the entrance with expressions that suggested they had suddenly realized someone important had not yet taken his place inside. The courthouse doors swung open with quiet urgency as three senior event organizers stepped onto the granite landing, their composed expressions giving way to visible concern while they scanned the growing crowd. One of them, Chief Coordinator Rebecca Collins, checked the time on her tablet before looking toward the registration desk. "Has Mr. Ellison arrived yet?" she asked. A volunteer hesitated before pointing toward the security checkpoint. Rebecca followed the gesture, and the moment her eyes settled on Marcus standing patiently beneath the stone column, her face changed instantly. Without saying another word, she walked briskly across the plaza, followed by two administrators and a member of the plainclothes security team. Daniel Brooks noticed the group approaching and instinctively straightened his uniform, assuming they had come to address a routine security matter. "Good morning," he said confidently. "Everything is under control." Rebecca barely acknowledged him. "Mr. Ellison," she said warmly, extending both hands with unmistakable respect, "we have been looking everywhere for you. We were beginning to worry that your flight had been delayed." Marcus smiled gently. "I arrived a little early. There was a misunderstanding at the entrance, so I decided to wait." Rebecca's expression softened with genuine regret. "I sincerely apologize for the delay. The governor, the Chief Justice, and every member of the keynote panel are already inside waiting for your arrival." The words seemed to freeze the surrounding air. Conversation stopped. Volunteers exchanged startled glances. Even the television crew nearby slowly turned their cameras toward the unexpected exchange. Daniel blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. "Waiting for him?" he asked quietly. Rebecca looked toward him with polite confusion. "Of course. Attorney General Marcus Ellison is delivering this morning's opening address. His remarks begin the entire leadership forum." Daniel stared at Marcus, then back at Rebecca, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. None appeared. At that exact moment, the large display screen visible through the courthouse lobby illuminated with the official event program. The rotating welcome slide disappeared, replaced by a formal portrait that every guest inside immediately recognized. Beneath the photograph appeared bold lettering that could be read even from outside the entrance. Attorney General Marcus Ellison, keynote speaker, National Leadership Award recipient, Columbia Law School distinguished alumnus. The same Columbia degree Daniel had mocked only minutes earlier now appeared beside Marcus's official biography on the enormous screen. A quiet wave of realization spread across the entrance. The retired judge lowered his head with a knowing sigh. The young prosecutors who had watched in silence looked at one another with disbelief. The first-year law student Marcus had helped gather her papers covered her mouth in astonishment. Daniel felt every confident assumption he had made that morning quietly dissolve without a single raised voice from the man standing before him. Marcus never mentioned the remarks about his diploma. He never reminded anyone how long he had been left waiting. He simply picked up his leather briefcase, adjusted the frame containing the Columbia degree, and offered Rebecca a courteous smile. "Thank you," he said. "I believe we still have enough time to begin on schedule." Rebecca nodded gratefully before motioning toward the courthouse entrance. As Marcus walked beside the event organizers, every plainclothes security officer subtly shifted into position around him with practiced professionalism, not creating a spectacle, but quietly revealing a level of preparation that had been present all along. Only then did Daniel finally understand that the man he had spent the entire morning trying to measure had never needed to prove who he was. Because genuine authority does not announce itself at the door. It simply walks through it when the moment arrives. The applause inside the grand auditorium began the moment Marcus Ellison stepped through the center aisle, not because someone instructed the audience to stand, but because respect often moved faster than protocol. Governors, judges, legislators, law professors, and community leaders rose from their seats almost instinctively. The large display screens surrounding the stage continued showing his name beside decades of public service, landmark legal reforms, and academic achievements that had inspired a generation of young attorneys. Marcus acknowledged the audience with a humble nod before taking his place near the podium. He neither hurried nor lingered. Every movement reflected the quiet confidence of a man who had never confused recognition with importance. Outside the auditorium doors, however, Officer Daniel Brooks remained rooted to the same spot where certainty had abandoned him only moments earlier. The comments he had spoken throughout the morning echoed louder now than they ever had when he first said them. For the first time since beginning his shift, he replayed every exchange in his mind without the comfort of believing he had been right. The framed Columbia degree, the invitation envelope, the patient answers, the calm expression, and the simple statement that respect should never depend on assumptions all returned with startling clarity. Nearby, the retired judge approached Daniel with measured steps. His voice remained calm, carrying neither anger nor satisfaction. "A uniform gives authority," he said quietly. "Character determines how that authority is used." Daniel lowered his eyes without answering. Across the lobby, two members of the courthouse administrative staff reviewed security footage from the entrance as part of routine event documentation. No one appeared rushed. No one raised their voice. Everything proceeded through established procedures, just as the justice system was designed to function. Rebecca Collins spoke briefly with the director of court security, explaining the unnecessary delay that had kept the keynote speaker outside the building. The director listened carefully, asked several factual questions, and requested that the incident be documented for internal review. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public accusations, only the steady movement of accountability beginning exactly where professionalism required it to begin. Inside the auditorium, Marcus approached the podium as the applause gradually faded into respectful silence. Before opening his prepared remarks, he looked across the audience and smiled warmly at the hundreds of students seated among experienced legal professionals. "Every career in public service begins with a choice," he said. "The choice to see people as individuals before seeing them as assumptions." The room grew completely still. His words carried no bitterness despite everything that had happened only minutes earlier. Instead, they carried the unmistakable weight of lived experience. He spoke about opportunity, fairness, and the responsibility entrusted to every person who represented the law. He praised teachers who opened doors, mentors who believed in potential, and communities that strengthened justice by insisting it belonged to everyone equally. Not once did he mention the encounter outside the courthouse. Not once did he criticize anyone by name. Yet those listening understood that the most powerful lesson of the morning had already taken place before the conference had officially begun. Outside the auditorium, Daniel quietly watched the speech from a monitor mounted in the courthouse lobby. Every sentence seemed directed not at him alone, but at anyone who had ever allowed appearances to speak louder than truth. In that moment, he realized that genuine leadership was not demonstrated by winning an argument or proving someone wrong. It was demonstrated by possessing every reason to seek personal vindication and choosing instead to strengthen the principles that protected everyone equally. When the final applause echoed through the auditorium, the audience remained standing longer than anyone had expected. It was not simply respect for the office Marcus Ellison held. It was respect for the quiet dignity with which he had carried himself long before anyone inside the building recognized his name. As guests gathered in the reception hall for coffee and conversation, people continued discussing the keynote address. Law students quoted his remarks about fairness. Judges reflected on his reminder that every decision shaped public trust. Community leaders spoke about expanding mentorship programs for young attorneys. The morning had become more than another legal conference. It had become a conversation about the kind of justice people wanted future generations to inherit. Marcus stepped away from the crowd for a brief moment near a row of tall windows overlooking the courthouse lawn. He placed the framed Columbia degree on a nearby table while answering questions from several students eager to thank him for his encouragement. He listened far more than he spoke, asking each student why they had chosen the law and what kind of difference they hoped to make. Every answer seemed to matter to him. A few minutes later, Rebecca Collins approached quietly. "Attorney General Ellison," she said, "the Director of Court Security has completed an initial review. He asked whether you would like to file a formal complaint regarding what happened outside." Marcus paused before responding. His eyes drifted toward the entrance where sunlight continued pouring through the glass doors. "I appreciate the question," he replied. "The process should move forward exactly as it would for anyone else. Facts should be reviewed. Procedures should be followed. Personal feelings should not influence the outcome." Rebecca nodded with genuine respect. That is exactly what he expected you would say. Meanwhile, Officer Daniel Brooks had been asked to meet privately with the director of court security in a nearby administrative office. The conversation remained calm and professional. The director reviewed the recorded footage from the security checkpoint alongside written statements from volunteers and event staff. Daniel answered every question honestly. For the first time that morning, he did not try to justify his assumptions or minimize his remarks. Instead, he admitted that he had allowed personal judgments to shape professional decisions. The admission was difficult, yet it marked the first sincere moment of reflection he had experienced since Marcus arrived at the courthouse. Later that afternoon, as conference attendees prepared to leave, Daniel quietly approached Marcus near the front steps. There were no cameras nearby, no reporters, and no audience waiting to witness the conversation. Daniel removed his cap and spoke with visible humility. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I failed to treat you with the respect every person deserves." Marcus looked at him for a long moment before offering a small, understanding smile. "Apologies matter," he answered gently. "But what matters even more is what changes after today." Daniel nodded slowly. "It will." Marcus extended his hand, not as a gesture that erased the morning, but as one that acknowledged the possibility of growth. Daniel accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. Neither man spoke another word for several seconds. They simply stood beneath the courthouse columns while guests departed around them. The same place where assumptions had first taken shape, now becoming the place where accountability quietly began. Sometimes justice is not measured by humiliation or revenge. Sometimes its greatest victory is creating the opportunity for someone to recognize a mistake, accept responsibility, and choose a better path forward than the one they walked before. Several weeks passed before the Jefferson State Justice Leadership Forum became little more than another date on the calendar for most people who had attended, but for many others, especially the young law students who had witnessed the events of that morning, it became the story they carried into every classroom, internship, and courtroom they entered afterward. They rarely spoke about titles or official positions. Instead, they remembered the quiet man who never argued, never demanded recognition, and never allowed another person's assumptions to define his own character. Marcus Ellison returned to his daily responsibilities with the same humility that had marked every step of his journey. His office continued reviewing legislation, meeting with local prosecutors, and expanding legal education programs designed to help students from underserved communities pursue careers in public service. When asked during a university interview what achievement made him the proudest, he surprised everyone by saying it was not a courtroom victory, a national award, or the office he held. It was hearing a first-generation college student say, "Because someone believed in me, I believed in myself." Those words soon appeared on bulletin boards in law schools across the state. Officer Daniel Brooks also returned to work, but he did not return as the same person who had begun that morning outside the courthouse. Following the internal review, he completed additional professional development focused on impartial decision-making, respectful public interaction, and ethical leadership. More importantly, he chose to continue learning long after the required training had ended. He began volunteering at community outreach events, speaking with high school students interested in careers in law enforcement, and reminding every new recruit that authority carried an obligation to treat every individual with equal dignity before reaching any conclusion. He never hid the lesson he had learned. Instead, he used it to encourage others not to repeat his mistake. Months later, Marcus and Daniel crossed paths again during a scholarship ceremony honoring future law students. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it reflected how much had changed. Daniel congratulated several scholarship recipients before quietly thanking Marcus once again for responding to that difficult morning with patience instead of pride. Marcus smiled and looked toward the students celebrating with their families. "If today helps even one future lawyer or one future officer choose fairness over assumptions," he said, "then that morning accomplished far more than either of us imagined." Daniel nodded in complete agreement. As the ceremony concluded, dozens of young students walked across the stage carrying acceptance letters, dreams, and hopes that looked remarkably similar despite their different backgrounds. Watching them, Marcus gently picked up the same framed Columbia Law School degree that had quietly accompanied him through every chapter of his life. It had never been a symbol of superiority. It had always been a reminder that opportunity grows wherever perseverance meets compassion. The courthouse, the conference, and the misunderstanding eventually faded into history, but one lesson remained impossible to forget. A uniform may represent authority, a diploma may represent achievement, and a title may represent responsibility, but none of them reveal the true measure of a human being. Character does, because in the end, justice is never strongest when it humiliates someone. Justice is strongest when it replaces prejudice with understanding, assumption with truth, and power with integrity. And that is why the quietest person in the room sometimes leaves behind the loudest legacy.